This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
On training missions over Hawaii. The death of these 5 men struck hard, but there would be more loss of life. We all knew this from the beginning, but we were fully prepared to make that sacrifice for the United States. On August 14, 1945, 5 months and 8 days after that first flight to Iwo Jima, I was flying a combat mission over Tokyo. 5 days had passed since President Truman ordered a second atomic bomb dropped, this time on Nagasaki, on August 9th. For the men of the 78th Fighter Squadron, and for all the pilots flying off Iwo Jima, we had hoped that the second bomb on August 9th would end the war, and that we would never have to fly another mission in combat. The President gave the Japanese an opportunity to surrender. We had been ordered to stand down, but August 10th passed, and still the Japanese refused to surrender. So we were ordered back into the skies, with orders to resume striking Japanese targets of opportunity on the Japanese homeland and to keep attacking until they surrendered. My wingman that day was a 19-year-old Jewish kid from Brooklyn named First Lieutenant Philip Schlomberg. Phil had a life full of promise and opportunity in front of him. The valedictorian of Abraham Lincoln High School in Brooklyn, Phil's service entrance test scores were among the very highest in the history of the Army. Because of our common Jewish heritage, and because he was one of our younger pilots, I had naturally taken Phil under my wing. On the morning of our final flight, Phil had a premonition that he was going to lose his life. Phil had flown in combat before, but this mission had a different feel for him. I had found that whenever a pilot had a premonition, that premonition was usually right. I approached our commanding officer, Major Jim Tapp, about grounding Phil for the flight and substituting another wingman, but Phil would have none of it. He was determined to fly the mission, premonition or no premonition. It happened shortly after we had attacked an airfield over Tokyo, just after noon. We had avoided being hit by anti-aircraft fire up to that point, but I was worried about Phil. I told him to stay tight on my wing, and that he would be okay, and he had done just that. We hit the field, and then climbed into a cloud embankment, with Phil flying tight in beside me. When I emerged from the clouds a few minutes later, Phil was gone. I never saw him again. When I landed back on Iwo Jima, I learned that the war had been over for several hours, and the Emperor had announced cessation of hostilities even as we attacked that airfield. Phil and I never received the broadcast code on our radios, signifying the war's end. Phil Schlomberg, as it turned out, would take his place in history as the last known combat death of World War II, and together, Phil and I had flown the final combat mission of the war. History sometimes serves fascinating slices of irony. With the news emerging in 1945 of the Nazi atrocities against Jews half a world away, how ironic that the war's final mission would be flown by a couple of Jewish pilots from New York and New Jersey, and that the final combat life in the defense of freedom would be laid down by a teenage Jewish fighter pilot who had not yet learned to even drive a car. The Last Fighter Pilot, by Don Brown, is not only my story during the final 6 months of the air war against Japan from Iwo Jima, but is also the story of many brave fighter pilots with whom I served, the overwhelming majority of whom are long since gone. I lost 16 of my fellow squadron pilots during the war, men who I knew personally, and 11 of them were killed during the final phase of the air war from Iwo Jima. Most of the others have long since passed into eternity. Now, at the age of 93, I am left standing to speak on their behalf. Our story needs to be told for the sake of fully completing the history of the war. I have said that the greatest honor of my life is to have served my country. Now, just 3 weeks past my 93rd birthday, I remain standing for my fellow pilots. And still, the greatest honor of my life is to have served with these men, and to have served my country. Jerry Yellin, Captain, U.S. Army Air Force, Orlando, Florida, March 7, 2017. Forward by Melanie Sloan. In loving memory First Lieutenant Philip Schlomberg, United States Army Air Force. Editor's note. First